You're listening to Emerging Global by BNE IntelliNews.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the BNE IntelliNews podcast. I'm Daniel Rad and I'm here today with Farzan Sabet, who is an expert in international relations and previously worked with the United Nations. Am I correct?
That's right, United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research.
Thank you very much. Today we're going to be talking about the succession following the sudden death of President Ebrahim Raisi in Iran, who died in a helicopter crash on May 19th, close to the border with Azerbaijan. Along with Raisi, Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdullahian also passed away, along with several other people on board, including the Friday Prayer leader for Tabriz. Farzan, what do you think happens now in the wider scheme of things in Iran following Raisi's death?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, according to Article 131 of the Iranian Constitution, following the death or otherwise incapacitation of the president, the first vice president assumes his authorities and responsibilities with the approval of Iran's leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. That's already happened. Basically, the first vice president, Mohammad Mokhbar, has taken over as acting president, and subsequently a council is formed composed of the first vice president, the speaker of parliament, and the chief justice, who are required to organize an election of a new president, basically within a period of 50 days. And if I'm not mistaken, the Ministry of Interior has already released a preliminary schedule for the elections.
And I believe it's June 28th, is it?
That's right. So, I mean, it's going to unfold in several stages. So basically between the 30th of May and 3rd of June, the initial candidate registration is going to take place. Between the 4th and 10th of June, the Council of Guardians, which is a quasi-constitutional body partially both directly and indirectly appointed by the leader, is going to vet potential candidates during those dates. Then on the 11th of June, the Interior Ministry will announce the approved candidates who are going to run for the election. And there's basically going to be a very truncated campaign of around 14, 15 days, which is going to take place between the 11th and 26th of June. And as you said, the election itself is expected to be held on the 28th of June. Although if no candidate wins a majority, which depending on the nature of candidates who are approved is a distinct possibility, then a second round of voting will take place on the 5th of July to elect a president in line with the constitutionally mandated 50-day limit for having a new president in office.
I mean, this one, and the sudden course of events has thrown everybody in Iran off course. Raisi was expected to be there at least for another few years. And, as people said, he was potentially going to be lined up for the next supreme leader role after Khamenei. Now that's not going to happen. So with him out the way, which figures do you see most likely and which most likely candidates to emerge in the next presidential election?
Well, the field is wide open right now. No one was expecting for a presidential election to take place for at least another year. And the expectations, at least among mainstream analysts, was that Raisi would very likely be reelected again. So even the potential candidates from his side of the aisle, the so-called principlist, what in the Western media is often referred to as the conservative or hardliners, we're likely not going to field a competitive list of candidates given Raisi's incumbency. Now that's thrown, Raisi's death has thrown everything into chaos, and so the field is wide open, and it's unclear who's going to run, and just as importantly, who's going to be approved to run by the Guardian Council. An initial frontrunner, at least in my mind, is current Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Bagher. He has a few things going for him. So first of all, he has a wealth of high-level executive and administrative experience. So he served as a senior commander and a division commander during the Iran-Iraq War. He was the head of the IRGC Air Force, among other senior roles within the Islamic Revolution Guard Corps. After the war, he served as chief of police, as well as mayor of Tehran, and most recently, during the last 4 years, as Speaker of Parliament. So he's held a wide range of administrative positions across the state apparatus of the Islamic Republic. So he has the wealth of experience, and just as importantly, he has the ambition. So he's run for president at least 3 times before, in 2005, 2013, 2017. In 2005 and 2013, he lost in both of those instances. In 2017, he withdrew in favor of then-candidate Raisi, although Raisi subsequently also lost that election to incumbent President Hassan Rouhani. So he's got the experience, he's got the ambition, but he's also got certain things going against him. So there a certain faction within the principalist or conservative political current in Iran do not like him, especially the more hardline elements. He's probably somewhat associated with the less hardline elements of the principalists. And additionally, he's had a few corruption scandals, both personal and connected to his broader network of power, that have haunted him since at least his days in the Tehran mayor's office. But at least without any further information right now, he seems like a potential obvious frontrunner. Of course, he doesn't meet some of the criteria, which are the reasons that Raisi was probably placed into that position. Raisi, for his part, followed something which in Persian is regarded to as Vedayat Medari, meaning he was completely obedient to the line and person of the leader, in this case, Ayatollah Khamenei. And so what this would have done in case of succession was triggered by the death or incapacitation of Ayatollah Khamenei would have been to place him as among the place former President Raisi as among the key decision makers to manage the transition. And given his loyalty, both ideologically and personally to the leader, he could have been expected to be a rather predictable figure who would kind of move along with the consensus and, let's say, the plan that the leader and those around him had set in place prior to the leader's death. It's not clear if, for example, somebody like Ghalibaf would play the same role, given that he's proven sometimes in the past to be a little bit mercurial, and given that he is very ambitious.
And talking about obedience, there was the Khobrogan meeting yesterday in the old Senate building in Tehran, and Ahmadinejad, former President Ahmadinejad, was there wearing a white shirt, and that caused a lot of ruffled feathers, with people suggesting he's sending a message that he's coming back for another round. What do you think there?
Yeah, so Ahmadinejad obviously has a very long history in the upper echelons of the Islamic Republic. He initially rose to fame as kind of a black horse candidate that won the election for the Tehran mayoralty in 2003, part of the then new emerging principalist political current, and then subsequently ran in 2005 for president and won a first term in 2005, and then in 2009 won another term, of course, in that instance, much more controversially, where there were allegations of rigged elections and subsequent large-scale protests that we refer to as a Green Movement protest. So Ahmed, during the period from 2003 to 2005, when he initially rose power first as the mayor of Tehran and then president, there was a sense among the emerging new right in Iran, what we call the principalists, that they needed a figure, they needed ideas, they needed kind of political groupings to put into the field to compete with the reformists who had at that point held power for many years under President Khatami. And so in their desperation, they turned to a figure like Ahmadinejad, who on the surface seemed quite charismatic and could put together a rather sizable political coalition inside Iran, but who they didn't fully understand. Subsequently, Ahmadinejad had a falling out not only with many other principalists, but with the leader himself, often putting himself in a position where he was viewed as disobeying the leader. He's tried to make a comeback several times. If I'm not mistaken, the last election he tried to stand and was disqualified by the Guardian Council. And so given that predictability and stability will be important for the leader and those around him as part of the succession process, it appears to me highly unlikely that they would allow somebody like him back into, let's say, an elected center of power like the presidency. First, that they would vet him to be approved to run for the election, and even if he was, that they, he would be empowered to win that election. So
you think you would say that, for example, he's a little bit too dangerous even for them?
Absolutely, I think that's been the perception around him since he left office in 2013. Absolutely.
Well, this leads on to the next question, which is, public participation.
Yeah.
The legitimacy of the elections is under severe scrutiny, especially after the low turnout in previous cycles. The regime's handling of candidates' disqualifications and its response to the public discontent will impact voter turnout. And after the recent local elections, where the parliament was left hanging with many people refusing to vote, there's a massive crisis of legitimacy at the moment within the system itself to actually pull in the voters. How do you think they're going to deal with that?
Absolutely. If I'm not mistaken, the overall turnout for the parliamentary elections was something in the first round was something like 40%, which was lower than even the last presidential election. And then within Tehran, which is kind of seen as this seat of power and symbolically and materially very important place to be elected in, it was as low as 8%. And if I'm not mistaken, the current Speaker of Parliament, Ghalibaf, who we noted as a potential candidate, he came in fourth, if I'm not mistaken, which is another black mark against him for running for president alongside his corruption scandals. So in terms of this question, I think the current leadership of the Islamic Republic has two choices. One is they can go for public participation and mobilization and enhancing legitimacy, especially during a time of profound social and economic crisis and political upheaval, both at home and in the region. Or on the other hand, they can go for stability and predictability and keeping the circle of power tight ahead of a succession. It's very possible that, given how things have unfolded during the Raisi presidency, in my view, despite the severe limits on his power, as well as the structural constraints that he faced, he didn't perform particularly well. So despite this kind of set of circumstances, they could do a course, or because of this, they could do a course correction and try to elect a much more popular figure and have a more competitive election that would increase public participation. Or, on the other hand, they could go for stability and predictability. And I don't see any reasons why they will change course now, because the fundamental reason for going for stability and predictability and lowering the competitiveness of elections and bringing into power people like Raisi in the first place was to prepare the way for a succession which was controlled and predictable in terms of its outcome and the person who would become leader, and then the circles of power that were basically maintaining to a large degree the status quo as it exists after the passing of the current leader. I don't see any reason why that calculus has changed. Now, it's very possible in the halls of power they are seeing the crisis different, or the state of things much more differently, and they're seeing the crisis that exists, and they may change course. I just don't see it.
And the next question, obviously, regarding the supreme leader's role, or whoever will now be the next supreme leader. There has been rumours for years that Raisi was allegedly set up to be the next person, albeit with much more limited powers than the current supreme leader, by the system itself. Do you think there's any truth to that? And the fact that he's no longer here, what do you think this means for the succession plans in that regard?
Mm-hmm. Regarding Raisi, I first heard his name, I believe it was in 2016, as a potential contender for let's say, very high office. In 2016, somebody who was very politically knowledgeable and connected, both within Iranian politics as well as in the kind of religious circles in Qom and beyond, told me that, this is a figure who meets a certain set of criteria. And I believe at the time he set out 6 criteria, which Raisi met, which would make him, in the view of the current leadership of Iran, a quote-unquote kind of perfect candidate for the leadership. That is what we would call supreme leader in the Western media context. And there was quite a large amount of buzz around him when he came in. There are a number of different schools on what his very, very quick rise, especially between 2016 and 2017, meant. One interpretation is that he was considered a reliable figure to put, for example, in the presidency, alongside many other figures who were set in other kind of key positions, in order to pave the way for the succession and a new leader, and that he wasn't necessarily going to be personally himself the leader. There's a second theory, which is that no, this was part of his grooming to become leader, because if you look at his CV prior to becoming president, basically from the time of the revolution onward, from the very early 1980s, he's serving in judicial positions, which in terms of the type of experience and the type of knowledge and skills that it requires is very different from, let's say, executive and administrative type positions. Basically, from the early 80s up until 2016, and then again between, I think, 2016 to 2019, or is it 2019, 2021? But anyways, so for a very long period, he served almost exclusively in judicial position. I believe there was a period of 2 years where he served as the head of the Astana Botserezavi, which is the Imam Reza Shrine Foundation, from 2016 to 2019. But besides that, he had, for example, between 2014 and 2016, served as the prosecutor general of the country, and then between 2018 and 2021 as the kind of chief justice of the country. So these were judicial positions that didn't necessarily prepare him for something like the leadership. So the second theory was that he was being groomed and prepared for the leadership and gaining very high-level executive administrative experience, for example, in the role of a presidency, was part of the pathway of preparing him to be a leader, to take on the leadership role at the very top. And then there was kind of a third theory, which is that, and this is on the bit more conspiratorial side, and I haven't perhaps seen as much direct evidence for it, but that he was kind of a patsy who was put there to take a lot of the hits, and then some other figures, either another figure or other figures, would be presented for the time of the leadership when this time came for succession. Personally, I lean a little bit closer to the first theory, which is that he was an important component of preparing the pathway for the succession. I believe he was very likely considered as a serious contender for the presidency, but that subsequent experience, for example, losing in 2017 and the, I would say, rather lackluster performance of his administration and his own personal, let's say, lack of charisma, speaking ability, and kind of political skill on the national stage, probably diminished his stature as a leadership candidate. So it was likely that he was seen as an important part of the plan, considered a very serious candidate for the position, but that his stature had diminished, and so it was less likely the case that he was going to be leader, given how things had been unfolding until his death.
That's interesting. So now that, the system, the playing field is right open in that regard, how could the results of the upcoming election, and whoever gets elected in the end, how could that impact the country's foreign policy? I mean, we have to look at, for example, the JCPOA, which was under the office of the foreign minister, who is also now gone. That is still hanging in the balance. There's a potential Trump administration being factored into probably Iran's calculations and everybody else's. And, there's the regional realignment and, increase in relations with, for example, Saudi Arabia. So how does Iran now see itself in the wider context and the security apparatus of the Middle East?
That's an interesting and I think very relevant question. So in Iran, the overall direction in domestic politics and foreign policy is set by the leader, who also directly selects or indirectly influences the selection of the heads of all the major elected and unelected centers of power in the Islamic Republic. So thereby shaping the system at every level through both policy and personnel. So within these boundaries, and these are now they've become, relatively narrow boundaries, the centers of power, whether they're elected or not, can individually set policy in a specific domain under their purview, or in some cases they have to come together to collectively shape policy in a consensus-building process and then implement it. And for one body, for example, where we see consensus-building style deliberation is the Supreme National Security Council, where various interested parties have representatives and come together based on the relative power of the different individual and groups in question in order to shape policy and then implement it. And obviously, all of this happens under the purview of the Supreme Leader and with his final sign-off. And at least when it comes to these type of consensus-building exercises, from what I understand, the leader rarely directly intervenes to change the kind of nature of the consensus that's been set out, or to change the decision that was made. So I think this is one of the things that's given a lot of robustness to the Islamic Republic, is that to the extent that there is participation by different actors and interest groups and power networks, they're allowed to have a voice and become part of this consensus-building process. So the Iranian presidency is a nominally elected center of power, which can play a strong role in this very specific context that I've laid out in shaping and executing policy to various degrees across a range of along a range of domains, including domestic politics, the economy, and foreign policy. And if you look at the structure of the Supreme National Security Council and who has representation there, the presidency, of course, with the sign-off of the leader in many instances. Within these very narrow boundaries that we've discussed, both in terms of the power of the leader and the consensus and deliberative process inside the Islamic Republic, the president does have a degree of power in terms of both shaping and executing policy to various degrees across a range of domains, including domestic politics, the economy, and foreign policy. And if you look at the structure of the Supreme National Security Council, many of the positions there are appointed by the president, although in certain key sensitive cases, they also have to be approved by the office of the leader. So if you get an ambitious new president with different political tendencies than the last president, and who decides to change the entire slate of the cabinet and appoint substantively different officials there in a field like national security and in a body like the Supreme National Security Council, it could shift the consensus. Now, given the direction of the Islamic Republic in the last few years, is it going to profoundly and fundamentally change the direction? I don't think so. But does it?
What is the direction? What is the direction?
Well,
to people who don't know, go on.
Well, yeah. So I think there's a few trends we have to be cognizant of when we think about a kind of Iranian foreign policy in the last few years. So one is that in terms of within the system, figures who are considered so-called more moderate have been systematically excluded, and many instances, younger, often less experienced, and much more hawkish, hardline political figures have been appointed across the entirety of the system, shifting the way in many instances of how policy is both created, the direction of that policy, and then how that policy is executed. So overall, although I think there's a huge element of continuity in the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic, it has also become much more, let's say, hawkish. That's probably how we would think of it in the West, compared to the possibilities that may have been open in years or decades past. Although some people will probably argue that actually nothing has changed and it's always been the same. But I think there are important enough shifts that we have to recognize that a change has happened. And one area where you can see this is in the area of nuclear negotiations, right? Just some very practical issues. Before Trump and the withdrawal from the JCPOA, you had a government like that of Hassan Rouhani with a foreign minister like Javad Zarif, who was very well networked and connected in the West, who understood the Western mindset, who was an expert in conducting multilateral diplomacy, who spoke English rather fluently and knew how to kind of engage in media narratives, engage with the Western media in order to get his message out there and his views out there, and even in many instances win acceptance for some of his ideas among the broad swath of Western elites and people. And if you look at the last foreign minister who passed away in the recent helicopter blast, was Hussein Amir Abdullahian, he was mainly experienced in the region. He was considered close with the Quds Force and the Revolution Guard, in the Islamic Revolution Guard Corps.
Isn't it true that Zarif was famously quoting him saying that Amir Abdullahian was of the Revolutionary Guards and a mole, in fact, in the foreign ministry?
I think that was certainly the perception of him among Zarif's set of diplomats. And his experience was also mainly at the regional level, right? He mainly worked in West Asia, what we call the Middle East, and to a lesser degree, Africa.
And he's an Arabic speaker as well, wasn't he?
As Arabic speaker, exactly. It didn't have when you look at a lot of other foreign ministers, and especially senior foreign ministry officials inside Iran, and this is pretty common across other foreign ministries, whether it's in the Middle East or elsewhere, the people who rise to be foreign minister often serve in whatever the equivalent of the multilateral department is. So they'll have a stint in New York and Geneva, in Vienna, or places like that, meaning they know how to conduct a multilateral diplomacy. They know how to operate at that level in let's say, English or French or another major international and Western language. And they have a wide network, and they're perhaps more capable in that sense of getting things done. And Amir Abdullahian didn't have any of that. And so I think there were questions regarding his stature, both within the ministry and outside. He's now been replaced by a figure, Ali Bagheri, who is connected to a very powerful clerical family inside the Islamic Republic. My sense is that the perception is that he's a more capable diplomat. From what I've seen, I'm not sure if he's very fluent in English, but it seems that he's able to better engage in the types of negotiations that maybe Iran needs to conduct, especially with certain Western states that it perceives as adversaries. And he's been involved, for example, in a so-called non-agreement with the U.S., which tried to put certain nuclear security and, let's say, other humanitarian and economic issues on the table, and came out in, I believe it was the summer of 2023. He was seen as being directly involved in getting that agreement. And when we talk about U.S.-Iran negotiations today, and these are indirect negotiations with other kind of third parties acting as go-betweens for the Iranians and the Americans. He's been conducting those and very closely involved in those negotiations as well. So having people in power who first would be much more capable, and second of all would have perhaps different ideas, makes a difference, because you have people with different ideas, and they're actually able to implement those ideas because of their knowledge and ability to kind of deftly manipulate the levers of power inside the Islamic Republic. Which I think there were questions around how effectively the Raisi government was able to do that.
But the Raisi government was part of a recent wave of new signings and agreements for the Islamic Republic, wasn't it? So under his power They signed the BRICS deal. They've joined the SCO. They've become very integrated with the Russian economy and the wider, former Soviet Union bloc. Armenia's prime minister is in Tehran today, Nikol Pashinyan. So now Raisi is gone. Do you think there's going to be any realignment, or do you think that was part of the upper echelons of the Islamic Republic system that orchestrated that rather than the Raisi team?
Yeah, so I think that's the key that you've kind of put your finger on right there. For things like the agreement to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia after several years of severed relations between the two sides, I would say that was just as much the initiative of the overall Islamic Republic system as it was for the Raisi government, although Amir Abdullahian and the Raisi government did, of course, play an important role.
Although he did the Saudi deal, it did look like he was sidetracked.
I believe it was a Supreme National Security Council, which was more involved and more effective there, but don't quote me on that. And then regarding relations with Russia, which is since 2022, I mean, the improving relations with Russia go back more than a decade, and they've been on a certain trajectory for many years now. But there is a kind of a decisive turn in 2022 after the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war. And in that context, I would say that that's also a much more strategic initiative of the Islamic Republic, where you have the armed forces, the Islamic Revolution Guard Corps, the military-industrial complex, much more closely involved in carrying out certain elements of the agreements that are happening there. And of course, the Raisi government, when it comes to the economic elements, have also been involved. But it wasn't purely an initiative of the Raisi government. And they weren't the only actors kind of negotiating, carrying out agreements under that framework. Other actors were very important as well, and more important in certain domains. And then when it comes to things like SCO and BRICS, SCO membership, I think, happened in 2023. I believe Iran's BRICS membership was kind of formally implemented or went into force on 1st of January 2024. These were very symbolically important, especially for a revolutionary and ideological system like the Islamic Republic. How much did it materially change things for Iran? It could in the future. Was it very meaningful in terms of addressing, for example, the myriad of security or economic issues that Iran faces today? I don't think so. So without denying that there was some importance there, I think that those were perhaps less meaningful than they might seem on the surface, at least in the short term. And so a future government, if it has a different set of priorities or wants to emphasize a set of activities that it sees much more important, I doubt they would, for example, withdraw from the SCO or BRICS. They might just emphasize it less, although I doubt it, given how much the Islamic Republic likes the optics of kind of working together with non-aligned state, with the global South, against certain notions of Western hegemony and Western institutional domination.
And final question for you. How do you think the historians will view Raisi's tenure as president?
Yeah, I think it will have been pivotal in certain ways, but not necessarily good ones. So the currency has fallen a great deal during his tenure. Of course, this, again, you can't attribute all of this to the Raisi government. Again, their power is limited, and at the same time, there were certain structural conditions that were there that affected how things played out. At the same time, I think the economic situation, whether it's GDP, whether it's in terms of the inflation rate and the value of the currency, whether it's in terms of the economic well-being of individuals, I think it's going to be viewed as quite a bad period. Now, how much of that you attribute to Raisi versus other actors or broader conditions will depend on how much you're probably a supporter of the Raisi government, or how granularly you decide to look at it to try to pick that up. So that's on the economic level. In terms of the social level, I think it will be viewed very positively by very strident supporters of the Islamic Republic who will see it as a fulfillment of a certain vision of principlist politics, having come together under Raisi's tenure. And for people outside of that circle, I think it will be viewed less positively and actually quite negatively. Raisi, I think one important thing which we didn't address when discussing kind of his background is that he's credibly accused of having been a key player in the mass execution of political prisoners in the 1980s, and subsequently in his role as judiciary was involved in very significant repression. And then following his days in the judiciary, when he's elected president, in 2022, September 2022 to December 2022, we have the Masa Amini protests, these protests that are triggered by the arrest of a young woman for allegedly having bad hijab or improper hijab, and she dies in police custody. And so what supporters of the system will say, or those who, let's say, support its broader kind of bent, is that, well, though she had pre-existing conditions and she died there, I think for much of the broader Iranian public and international community, it's going to look like that a young woman was arrested over a certain issue, which is very contentious, and in the grand scheme of things was probably not the biggest kind of crime or biggest problem happening in the country. And given the pressure that the young woman was under in police custody, died, or in some cases, people allege that she was killed through the deliberate action. So she was murdered in police custody. How that plays out, I think, depends a lot, or how you discern what happened to her depends on where you stand. But ultimately, what the undeniable fact is that she died in police custody, and this hit on such a sensitive issue inside Iranian society, which is the question of social freedoms, that led to an explosion of social unrest. And you had what I would argue were not the largest, but the most persistent, the longest lasting, and probably the most violent protests we've had since the Islamic Revolution. So the Green Movement protests, in terms of the overall numbers, were probably larger, but that was a protest that was happening within the framework of a certain aggressive form of reformism, and trying to maintain its grievances and its tactics within the boundaries of the Islamic Republic. And so was also confronted with a great deal of violence, but probably less so than the protests that came after. The protests that happened between September and December 2022 were much more widespread. I would argue they happened in many more places across the country from the various kind of tagging projects that I saw. It lasted longer, and it was much more violent, both in terms of the violence of the rhetoric and the actions of the protesters, who were stridently anti-Islamic Republic and made no bones about it, and were willing to engage and defend themselves against the security forces in ways that the Green Movement perhaps hadn't done except in certain very narrow contexts. And on the other hand, faced a very high level of state repression, and at least 500 protesters and demonstrators and people were killed. Now, there's some debate about whether more people were killed in the more economically oriented protests that happened in November in 2019. There's a number that's floating out there that says 1,500 were killed.
Those were the petrol protests, weren't they?
Exactly. I've seen less of an effort or I've seen less of a confirmation of the individual deaths related to those protests. The 500 number for the 2022 protests seem a little bit more credible to me. And then there was also, in my view, a very large-scale repression afterwards in terms of people being injured, including many women being shot in the eye and having other horrendous injuries. And at the same time, very large number of arrests and also expulsions from universities, firings, and also many more dead security forces. I think more than 50 of the security forces were killed, if not more. And since then, there's been a very dark social atmosphere and a high level of repression inside Iran, including executions of protesters who arguably did not go through judicial processes that met kind of basic standards of fair trial and due process. And subsequently, you've seen an attempt to further close or limit the social space, for example, with this hijab law that sets much, I would argue, harsher penalties for violations of the kind of modesty and hijab requirements of the Islamic Republic, and then increasingly a new law around cyberspace and the limitations it places and the way it reconfigures Iranians' freedom of access to the global internet. So all that together is looking at both the economic and the social sphere. I think it'll probably remembered quite negatively, the Raisi's legacy. Although everything will depend on how it looks compared to whatever the future alternative is. And then exactly. And then in foreign policy, I think I think the assessment will depend on how you view things and where you stand. Probably for the Islamic Republic, they made certain, let's say, moves forward in their foreign policy in terms of trying to be able to carve out more independent positions for themselves. Their relationship with China, their relationship with Russia especially, the diplomacy they were able to conduct during the current Gaza war, and their support for the acts of resistance. They've been obviously able to have quite an extensive kind of influence in the current context, while mostly, except for the mini crisis we had in April, mostly staying out of it. So I think if you view those things as good for Iran and good for the Islamic Republic, then you're going to view the foreign policy legacy quite positively. I'm a little bit more skeptical, and I think we'll have to wait and see how things turn out. For example, will Iran escape the kind of fires burning in Gaza, or will the conflict expand beyond Gaza, which it already has? We're already kind of in a global war, in a broader regional war. It's just happening here or there. It's happening in small episodes or tit-for-tat attacks, so we don't view it as a regional war. But will the, let's say, bounds of that regional war and the level of violence, the level of engagements increase? It's a distinct possibility. So again, for in the foreign policy sphere, it remains to be seen how things turn out.
A lot to unpack there. Okay, well, Farzan, is there any way people can follow you on X, formerly known as Twitter?
Sure. So I write on X under the moniker Iran Wonk. So it's just at Iran Wonk, but you can search Farzan Sabet. And I try to write at least one weekly article, as well as doing other media interviews on my personal Substack, Iran Wonk Substack as well. So it's the same name, and you can find a link on my Twitter or X.
Great, super. Farzan Sabet, thank you very much for joining us on this week's BNE IntelliNews podcast. And we hope to have you again on soon.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.